Hello and welcome everybody to the inaugural Architectural Humanities Book Talk series. I firstly wish to recognize and pay respect to the elders and communities, past, present and emerging, of the lands in which our event takes place. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people. For thousands of years, through deep time, the elders and communities have shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in which you are on and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. My name is Daniel Ryan, and I'm the curator of this series, and I'm happy to welcome Olga Touloumi, who's assistant professor at Bard College, and she'll be discussing her wonderful new book, Assembly by Design, the United Nations and its Global Interior, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2024. We're also very grateful to have Claire Zimmerman join us as respondent. Claire is professor at the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto and recently was the Penelope visiting professor here at University of Sydney. This is our first talk in the series, and in fact was sparked by Olga's call out in Blue Sky some months ago to say she'd be up to talk about her new book. So we thought, why not do this as a series? The format for these talks is deliberately brief to account for everyone's busy schedules or maybe shortened attention span, take your pick, so roughly about 30 minutes. I'll go talk first, and then we'll hear a response from Claire, and there should be time for a little Q&A at the end. We also have some links and discount codes if anyone would like to get a copy of the book, which of course highly recommend. I should mention that the talk is being recorded and will be available on Architecture, Design and Planning's YouTube channel in coming days. So over to you, Olga.
Share my screen.
Oh,
hear my voice back. Share. Here we are. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. So thank you, Daniel, for this wonderful introduction and for the invitation to talk about my book on this platform. It is truly an honor, and thank you for bringing us all together and creating this new resource for books in architectural history and architecture. And also thank you, Claire Zimmerman, for taking the time to engage with this work, and Amelia Stanmore for the invisible labor you're putting backstage in holding all this together, keeping this together. So today I'm joining you from the sacred homelands of the Lenape people, only a couple of miles away from the United Nations headquarters. I will be talking to you about my book, Assembly by Design, the United Nations and its Global Interior, a book that started as a couple of chapters in a dissertation on architectures of global communication, and which after a particularly productive PhD Viva discussion transformed into a book that examines the emergence of a new architecture for international diplomacy. Now, the book was published by the University of Minnesota Press earlier last fall as part of the series Buell Center Books in the History and Theory of American Architecture. So also I want to extend a big thank you to Reinhold Martin for making this happen for me, as well as for the stewardship and conversation. Now, Assembly by Design is a book about the diplomatic architectures that emerged during the mid-20th century to structure the public sphere of the UN system in particular. The stories that we know about the UN often center on the episodic transaction that led to the purchase of the site on Turtle Bay that ended up anchoring the UN in New York City, or the 4 months of architectural debate that followed, along with Mumford's relentless criticism of the headquarters as a symbol of managerial culture entering the world of diplomacy. He was not entirely wrong. My book argues that to understand how certain ideas about global governance and its space is materialized, and to that effect, to identify those ideas and debates, we need to look outside the headquarters at the wide array of spaces where the UN negotiated its organizational structure in situ. Those spaces and structures are often found inside interiors of other buildings and manifest as refurbishments. And these refurbishments shaped, I argue, the way the UN platforms before Wallace K. Harrison's mini UN of architects came into being. So in a way, there is there a secondary argument I'm trying to make about method and the place of those temporal or ephemeral, if you like, configurations of the body politic within architectural history. In my book, this is a story that starts with the conference plenary halls, roundtables, and meeting rooms where the new then world order was ironed out. It continues in the courtrooms where the idea of an international system of justice was worked out, and then inside the temporary headquarters where the various bodies of the UN met and configured their practices and procedures. The skating ring in Flushing Meadow, the Hunter College Gym, the Sperry Gyroscope Factory in Lake Success, and so on. But I also want to think of Assembly by Design as a book about the history of liberal internationalism. Here you see a map that was put together by the State Department in the end of the San Francisco Conference in 1945, showing the member states in pink and light pink. The distinction is to identify member states and colonies and their territories. Mandate territories. In yellow, you have the Axis power, and then in green, the states that were not actually participating. So I would like to think of Assembly by Design as a book about the history of liberal internationalism, the world order we have inherited and which we see today being dismantled rapidly before our eyes. It is the story of a project replete with contradictions, at the same time, a utopian project to create an international platform for its member states and a system through which to exercise what Foucault calls security power to manage risk and war in an era of decolonization. This is a project formulated against the oceanic reverberant masses of totalitarian regimes and at the same time continuing to a certain extent, willingly or unwillingly, the dependencies and asymmetries established within colonial regimes. So these contradictions are kind of structural to the project of the UN. Now, as liberal internationalism, I understand the political project of installing an infrastructure of global institutions to negotiate treaties and policies on a global scale, ultimately managing war, development, and the markets in the name of peace, security, and liberal values. It is with this banner of liberal internationalism that Woodrow Wilson entered conversations on the League of Nations to only fail due to plummeting public support back home. And under the same banner, Franklin Delano Roosevelt joined the negotiating table, initially with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, and later with Chiang Kai-shek, forming the Big Four of World War II. Of course, these were not negotiations based on shared values, but mostly and similarly to our contemporary moment, arbitrations on how to share in power in the redistribution of the world at the time. Let's not forget that the emergence of the UN is situated within two intersecting trajectories, the emergence of the US as an imperial power and the dismantling of older colonial powers, who were seeking to retain power over their colonies through new systems of international organization. So the US government saw in the UN system a vehicle to claim a central position in the passage from a colonial to an institutional organization of the world, and the waning colonial powers a way to maintain control over their colonies. We see the limits of this world and system today, challenged by new power configurations and the rise of a multipolar, authoritarian this time world. Now, I'm telling this story from the perspective of architecture and the spaces designed to host and shape its operations and institutions. Central in this story is a new type of space that proliferated after World War II and which I call the global interior. Now, the global interior constitutes the answer to a very basic and at the same time foundational to the organization question: how do we congress the world? How do we bring a world community and its political representation together in assembly without falling back into the aesthetics and politics of totalitarianism? This is a question that architects try to solve inside temporary headquarters, ultimately producing the global interior as it appears on our screens today. A media architecture of assembly, itself an assemblage of media systems, material infrastructures, procedures, and people, through which the UN orders, records, and broadcasts its body politic to the world community residing outside it. So in a way, it is a platform architecture, and I understand it as that. In this sense, the book understands architecture itself as a medium that orients dispositions and perspectives into the organization, orders its publics in degrees of participation and power, demarcates what is visible and what remains invisible about the UN, installs dichotomies, among them the one between headquarters and the field, that there is always a field outside and headquarters where decisions are made, and articulates the organization's rhetoric for its constituents outside it. The diplomatic spatial apparatus that I call the global interior, the UN system, and by extension, the larger dispositive of liberal internationalism, uses to effectively and efficiently deploy itself around the world, installing its logics and structures inside and at times outside institutional headquarters. But also it uses it to present an otherwise gargantuan in scale and operationally chaotic global bureaucracy as an articulate and ordered, even if contested, world. Now, these spatial structures of the global interior translate later into social structures and ways of convening international bodies of experts, students, NGOs, and so on and so forth, even without the architecture being there, without the walls really being there. To reconstruct what kind of medium architecture it is, I examined the smaller spaces of this complex organization as well, the broadcast studio, the simultaneous interpretation system, anechoic chambers, electroacoustic technologies that not only allowed the organization to reimagine entire council chambers and assembly halls as stages, so to speak, but also rendered participation to the UN as an atomized experience situated within the collective of a national delegation. In fact, this new world order posed the nation state, this idea of a homogeneous sovereign state with clear boundaries agreed upon with all neighboring countries and secured through treaties, was the desideratum a country or a peoples had to achieve and to enter the global stage of liberal internationalism as equal to other nation states. And regardless of relentless critiques of this political vision of world making, Black internationalists have imagined other visions of global freedoms, as have also indigenous activists. That was the model that survived and with which we moved forward. The book asks, and I'm just flagging some questions, what can we learn about liberal internationalism, the world order the UN system sought to manage, once we turn our attention to the architecture of its spaces of assembly, which were the debates, political alignments, and power structures that shaped those spaces, as architectures that make legible certain aspects of this old now world order and illegible other parts. These global interiors that the UN dispersed around the world can open windows onto the mode of production of liberal internationalism and its material reality, but also onto how architecture globalized the systems of management and organization, or one of the ways in which it globalized the systems of management and organization that we have inherited. I hope that the book will help us understand both their appeal and their limitations as we move forward to new imaginations of the public sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olga. I'll hand over to Claire to respond.
Olga, thank you so much. You've already answered some of the questions that I raised in this response, but I'm going to adjust in real time, and maybe we can have a little bit of back and forth at the end. First, I just want to say I found this to be a fascinating and deeply researched study. I learned a tremendous amount. The book has big topics. Among them, how the UN deployed mass media communications to turn its closed-door diplomatic work into publicly and globally disseminated internationalism, as we've heard. It joins a select number of recent books that explore the multimediatic or mixed reality of post-war global architecture. and yet its subject is so historically particular that it distinguishes the book from those other studies, to my mind. The single major effort after World War II that succeeded in some way to create an international political network that might prevent such a cataclysm as World War II and its triggering events from ever recurring. Given that where we find ourselves at the present moment, at least in North America, but I think perhaps globally, I interpolate a slightly nostalgic cast to this book, as if it explores something that has already come to an end, despite the continued existence of the UN. It made me think of post-1990s work on the former East Germany, the period of Ostalgie that surfaced soon after the GDR had become a historical trace. Is this, and this is, I guess, my question for Olga, is this where the UN finds itself today, hostage on the now hostile territory of America during the presidency of just one authoritarian among a motley crew of the same across the globe? What awaits such an internationalist institution in the years to come? This might be something that Olga can reflect on or can help us reflect on, as well as the question of how and whether she knew she was writing the first history of UN Ostalgie. I've learned so much from reading this book, and my comments and questions here relate to better understanding where it leaves us historians of the modern period, as well as where its author might be headed next. And some part of me wants to say into the public sphere, into the world of the NGO, into the UN, but I know you'll have other plans, Olga. The book comes alive in many places, most notably by introducing acoustics and sound design into the heart of the narrative. Early in chapter 3, The Voice of the World, on page 146, Touloumi contrasts the end goals of UN sound design with the soundscapes of National Socialism. This is a very dramatic moment in the book. We can reflect on how much or to what extent the entire aesthetic program of the UN and of Western modernism after 1945 self-consciously constructed itself against the National Socialist and Italian fascist architectural aesthetic. We know this well, but the book brings it into high relief. It's tempting to go yet further and speculate that it was explicitly designed against the strongman leader as a figure of governance. The book persuades me that this may have been the case with the description of room after room of large, round conference tables with many seats and many ancillary actors. It may have been so, but the book does not persuade me that it was so. This self-consciously bureaucratic architectural project was carefully directed by an experienced technocrat, Wallace K. Harrison. Was the design by committee, which Touloumi shows, anything but, was it anything but a foil for, or was it merely a foil for US neo-imperialism in the formation of the UN? And you've, I think, answered that in a more complex way than I phrased the question, Olga, by talking about the kind of colonial impulse across the world. But also, I think the book raises the question of whether there were not among its creators some earnest, serious anti-authoritarians. And maybe that's something to talk about as well. Clearly, in some respects, continuing pre-war modernism, the post-war period was nonetheless fundamentally different from what came before. This is not, to my mind, a simple opposition of figural classicism and modernist abstraction. Rather, it shows what happened to values like functionalism and transparency within a new technical regime that made both extremely impractical or otherwise impossible to construct. A new technocratic regime that Olga has analyzed so well, and I'm avoiding using the word expertly. Never mind the architect's emphasis on things like the new monumentality or looming postmodernism. technocratic modernism had more intractable practical problems on its hands, most of them connected to technology. And those are highlighted clearly in this book. Similarly, in the same chapter on page 177, she notes that the efforts to develop dedicated UN media outlets were replaced by a refocusing on media content rather than infrastructure. For me, this was another dramatic moment in the book, given its open contradiction of McLuhan's mantra, the medium is the message. That the UN doubled down on relaying content to existing media platforms rather than creating its own was seemingly a logistical necessity, we learn. It also seems to have been a crucial moment in the formation of the institution, and I'd love to hear Olga's thoughts on this, whether or not such a refocusing made the institution more accountable or more effective, or neither or both. It would appear to this reader that limits placed on the institution were generally to its betterment, not its detriment. But this also raises the question of what sort of institution it would have been had it controlled its media outlets as proprietary ones and not solidified, quote, the institution's dependence on national and private broadcast companies and telecommunications organizations. To me, this is a very important point in your book, Olga, that makes us reflect a little bit on the question of whether the medium is the message or whether the message is the message. And we could talk about that in relation to contemporary media outlets. I think it made the UN fundamentally different from an enterprise like Fox News, let's say. This chapter 3 made me want to know more about how the UN has worked since the designers and contractors completed their work. Has the institution in New York performed as expected? How has it affected its inhabitants and its constituency? I think we have some sense of that from our knowledge of the UN more generally, but it would be great to hear Olga's thoughts on how the building actually did work after it was finished. Throughout, the changes that the UN represented in a global political order are underlined as historical firsts or precedents that had many copies. And this is another important aspect of the book, that the UN inaugurates a new set of political practices in the built environment. The final chapter, The Headquarters and the Field, focuses on a close reading of the 1954 exhibition and workshop hosted by the government of Jawaharlal Nehru in Delhi, the International Exhibition on Low-Cost Housing, and a UN regional seminar on housing and community improvement. Olga's analysis of this important event makes clear that it was also a first of its kind, a kind of didactic, full-scale building exhibition with an entirely different kind of address and scope from earlier precedents like the Weissenhof-Siedlung, but also that it had historical consequences. Konstantinos Doxiadis, Touloumi tells us, began acoustics after his work for the 1954 exhibition, inaugurating a research enterprise that lasted for years afterward and whose consequences I think we are still coming to understand better. And finally, I find the book's somewhat restrained or even guarded tone both appropriate and interesting in and of itself. The author's opinions are seemingly held back in favor of the historical work that she does. This is laid out for us with extreme precision, not only in terms of historical facts, documented through an impressive set of notes, but also in terms of careful assessment of the pros and cons of the approaches delineated therein. I'd like to hear more about this tone. We might call it the historian's tone, although many historians don't adopt it. It reminds me, actually, that the jury is still out, that the UN is not yet a thing of the past, that we do not know the future, and that a tremendous experiment was undertaken there over the past 75 years. And that's all I have for today.
Unbelievable, Claire. Thank you so much. I mean, it is an unbelievably generous reading, but also such a careful reading. like no, seriously, like, so the restrained tone has to do with something that you laid out. It's very hard, like realizing how little I know about the institution. Like the more I have been researching it, the more I have been realizing how complex this institution is, and my inability to have like one say about what it did, right? Or like one assessment of it in its entirety, which made it difficult for me, even though I am an opinionated historian, and I enjoy reading histories with an argument up front and central. It made it very difficult for me to like use that tone in my own writing. But the second difficulty that I had has to do with what you identified as nostalgia about something that hasn't yet passed. And this started as a dissertation, and it started out of a curiosity about something that I experienced as a social space in my own country, right? Like this internationalist, the liberal internationalist value did not only exist within the UN, they slip outside it and becomes in very sneaky way part of our everyday and shape also the way we move in the world and how the conduits that we navigate. So for example, like the Erasmus program, like having the opportunity to find yourself within a university where you have select students from different nations forming like a certain public, or later on having this desire to find yourself as an international student in another continent, pursuing studies with that. So these kind of ideas and desideratums or desires are kind of like embedded within somebody's moves in the world. So there was that part of me there, right? And of course, there were the horrific events of like the last 2 years, through which I had to edit the proofs of my book, and through which a lot of, text got cut out, not out of censorship, but because my own position changed towards my own book, because this was a book done in like 10 years, right? So I'm not the same person anymore, for better and for worse. So this is just to address the what you identified as a tone problem, but in reality,
Not a problem, a strength, a positive.
But it is somehow like my view over like how a historian, like what the limitations of my method became very apparent to me. So it was difficult for me to write in any other way. So that is that answer. Now about the UN and the US, like the foil for the US new imperialism, as you call it. I don't say that very explicitly in the book, because that was definitely one part of it. And it's very, like, I have this section where I talk about how the State Department actually designed this space, designed the space of the inauguration of the organization in 1945, and actually sent in designers to facilitate the creation of a Department of Public Information inside the UN. So they were like really very much involved into the project from the very beginning. And of course, they are the one nation, the one member state that contributes the most financially. So in structural ways, the UN is foiled within that. But at the same time, within the UN, there is an argument that many historians of international relations make. You have new movements forming, like the non-alignment movement, or the Third World as a political project and not as, a derogatory term, right? So these things come together within these platforms. And you have times like the project has been contested from the very beginning. There is always like an imagination that we can find a different way of coming together as an international polity in an anti-authoritarian kind of way. So yes, you're right. And in a way, it was like a big, so I took notes of everything, but like, I'm not sure I will be able to address everything. I would try.
No. And maybe we should see if other people have questions. I don't know, Daniel, how does this work?
Yeah.
Well, I'm aware of time. We might allow perhaps at this point open up to one or two questions if anyone has it. I'm aware we kind of have a 30-minute slot. But let's maybe see if just for the last 5 minutes, if there are any burning particular questions people have. There was one that I was just wondering, Olga, which was about how you see the difference between maybe about the difference between writing about globalism versus writing about the planetary, which seems to be quite fashionable at the moment. And wonder whether you've had any thoughts on that side.
Well, this is part of, well, I'm not sure I do, because even like globalism, they were not using that term in particular. They were really thinking about internationalism. Like globalism comes as a term later on in the organization, and the planetary even further, like even more recently, becomes part of the vocabulary. Are you asking which would be like the right term to use, or like?
I suppose maybe the sense that, well, the UN certainly very implicated in thinking about the planetary later on, but also the sense of materiality and material impact of people that comes with thinking about the planetary, where often the global side of things can be really almost more about people, and the ecological part can get left to the side.
Yeah, I think it is a great question to think about. There is something in the structure, and this is to like combine two questions. There is something about the structure of the UN that needs to be reframed in a way, in terms of like how the nation is, it's kind of like central unit. Maybe like we need a different kind of internal structure of the organization to be able to truly take on the planetary as a question. But I'm not really sure I'm asking that. I think I need to think about it, because I was very restricted to this like the years before and right after the establishment of the UN headquarters to understand what happened there. So I don't think I'm really equipped to like answer this question right now, but I think it's a great provocation, and I need to think about it a bit more, and even like research how it takes shape within the UN system as a question.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm aware of time, and many people saying we need perhaps they're juggling a few bits. Look, thank you so much, Olga, for sharing your wonderful book. I've put some links in if people do want to follow up. But also thank you so much to Claire. So wonderful to see you again, and for such a considered and careful response too. Do join us again on the 2nd of April. Even for those in the States, please do, when Eva Diaz will join us to talk about her new book, After Spaceship Earth, Art, Techno-Utopia, and Other Science Fictions, which has been published by Yale University Press. That will be at 9 a.m. Sydney time, and I think that is 6 p.m. Eastern time in the United States. I think the clocks change the following week. And you can follow up as well if you wish to have a look at Olga's book. So thank you all again, and thanks for joining us today, and hope to see you in a few weeks' time.
Thank you, Daniel. And whoever wants to reach out or have a conversation, I'm more than happy. But thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Claire. That was spectacular. Thank you.
Thanks.